Now, it's common for one party's obligations under a contract to simply be to pay money, to tender payment. I'm going to buy something, enter into a contract. My obligation is to pay money in exchange for the other party giving me goods. There are certain rules regarding tendering of payment. We're going to go into detail regarding different types or different ways of tendering payment. But specifically for tendering payment, it's important to know that the debtor, so the person who owes the money, has the obligation to pay to the creditor. What does that mean? That means that their obligation is to pay rather than to be chased down by the creditor. But they only have that obligation once. If a debtor goes to a creditor and says, here, I want to pay you, and they tender payment, and the creditor says, no, I don't want it, and if the creditor is acting unreasonable, it's no longer the debtor's obligation to seek the creditor out and pay them. Now it's up to the creditor to find the debtor and to collect from the debtor. Now, there's a piece of legislation in Canada called the Currency Act, and that Currency Act sets up Canadian currency, and it describes what's called legal tender. And under the strict rules, a vendor or creditor only has to accept exact change. It doesn't actually have to give change. If you owe a store $5.49, technically under the Currency Act, that store can agree or can basically only accept $5.49. Now, practically speaking, that's never really going to happen because the store is going to go out of business if people have to be carrying around buckets full of pennies. So it's important, though, to know that legal tender can be used and can be relied on. There's an anecdote about the university, once one student showing up with buckets of nickels. And in that case, the Canadian Currency Act says that legal tender for nickels is $2. So if you're wanting to know what legal tender is for each denomination of change, take a look at the coin rollers, and that is what the maximum legal tender is for each amount of loonies, toonies, nickels, dimes, and pennies. So the first avenue of payment that you want to consider when it comes to tendering payment is, of course, the payment of money. Just cold, hard cash. Now, there are some pros to cold, hard cash. The first is that it's reliable. There's no question about obtaining the value of the $5 bill that you get because it's backed by the Canadian government. Money is also very beneficial in the sense that it's absolute. If you receive money from an individual for payment, there's no need to be concerned about where the individual got that money themselves. Money is clean when it comes to past claims. There are, of course, logistical cons when it comes to accepting money. Large transactions, money can be big and bulky. I don't know how many of you carry around, wads of hundreds, but not me. So it can be big and bulky, and that can be cumbersome. And of course, this idea that money doesn't really have an underlying title or previous claims can be an issue if your money is lost or stolen. It becomes very hard to trace or to find where that money goes and be able to recover it, especially if you're trying to recover it from a bona fide purchaser for value who has purchased it from the person that stole it from you. A much more common way to pay for items is through using a debit card. Now, a debit card is a plastic card you're given from your bank that allows you electronic access to your accounts. So when you go to a store and use your debit card, what you are doing is you're sending a signal to the bank instructing them to pay this particular vendor whatever money you've agreed to when you've clicked OK. Now, these aren't actually instantaneous transactions. They're pretty close, but they're not entirely instantaneous. The electronic debit system works through a series of clearing systems. So they will basically balance the books a few times throughout the day, in which bulk transactions will be approved through the bank, and the bank will debit your account. Now, the main issue with debit cards is also an issue that applies with credit cards, and that is unauthorized use. What if someone skims your card? Or what if you go and give the love of your life a PIN number and they go and rack up a whole ton of money? This is actually a case that happened sometime a few years ago in BC, where a spouse, former spouse, I imagine by now, but a spouse gave his PIN number to his spouse to go and use both his debit card and his credit card. And she went and racked up a whole bunch of charges, and he was trying to get out of them. And due to the fact that he had given the PIN, he was obligated to pay because that was breach of the agreement. So when you do get a debit card or a credit card, you agree not to share that PIN. And it's very important that you don't, because if you do, you could be on the hook, even though those transactions you've had nothing to do with. Now, checks are becoming an antiquated way of tendering payment. However, they are still quite common, so I do want to mention a few things about them. Similar to a debit transaction, what a check does is it's instructing the bank to pay the bearer of the check, either the person who is named on the check or the person endorsed on the back, pay them the money from your account. Now, that's the same as a debit transaction. But the time lag is of particular concern when it comes to writing a check. So if you tender payment by writing a check, it's considered not an absolute discharge of your obligations, but a conditional discharge. And that's because there's a lot of things that can go on in the time delay in between when a vendor receives your check and when they actually go and cash the check. And in particular, it's possible that you put a stop order payment on that check, or for whatever reason, the bank refuses to honor the check, mainly if it's an NSF check, there's not sufficient funds. If that happens, your debt to the vendor, the merchant, is revived and you continue to owe the obligation. Now, because checks were so prolific historically, there's actually a very large body of law surrounding the law of checks. I'm not going to go into it's way beyond the scope of this course, but it is important to know that there's a huge body of law regarding personal checks. And I also want to make mention that when I'm talking about checks in this regard, I'm not talking about certified checks, which in modern times, certified checks are also considered money orders or bank drafts. Now, and those checks differ in that if you would like a money order or a bank draft, what happens, you go to the bank and you say, I want a check, a certified check, bank draft, money order, for X amount of dollars. What happens is the bank takes that money from your account and then writes its own check. And so certified checks, money orders, bank drafts are very important. It's very important that there's a name on those, or that you keep very close eye on those, because they are as good as cash. It's a check written by the Bank of Nova Scotia. They're good for it. It also becomes an issue if it's lost, right? If there's a certified check or bank draft, money order, if you get one, the bank has deducted the $5,000 from your account, that check, and has replaced it in check form. If you lose that check, the bank is not going to be able to cancel the check and give you the $5,000 back. Now, credit card transactions get a little bit more complicated. When you get a credit card, you enter into a credit arrangement with a card issuer. You become a card holder and you enter into this relationship with a credit card company. And what that contract is that you agree to abide by the terms, and in exchange, the credit card agrees to lend you money. But this isn't the only relationship that's important when you pay for something by credit card. Each merchant that you purchase something from, that you have to pay money to, has also entered into an agreement with whatever credit card company you're using. In exchange, the merchant gets the benefit of being able to rely on the increased chance that they're going to get paid, and in exchange pays the credit card company fees for being able to accept that type of credit card. And the third arrangement, of course, is the contract that you enter into with the merchant for the purchases of those goods. So what happens when you swipe your credit card? What you are doing is you are telling the credit card company to pay that merchant. In exchange, they're going to put that dollar value that you've told them to pay the merchant onto a loan that you have agreed to pay pursuant to the cardholder agreement. Many internet transactions use what's called a 3PPS, or a third-party payment system. The reason for this is that you don't want to just give your account information, your banking information, to anybody online throughout the international community. So let's look at the example of PayPal. What exactly does PayPal do? PayPal creates a third-party sort of reservoir account where if you would like to buy something using PayPal, you put your money into your account with PayPal, and your money goes into PayPal's giant coffers. And then you purchase from a merchant who also has an account with PayPal. You instruct PayPal to take whatever amount you have in your account and transfer it to the merchant's account. This way, having the money flow through PayPal, it allows the parties to keep their anonymity and doesn't require the parties to disclose their banking information. Now, it's important to note, this is not credit. In order to work on PayPal, you actually have to put money into PayPal, and then you are able to spend it.